Student riots in Mexico. Manuel Noriega destabilizing Nicaragua. Colombian M19s storming the Palace of Justice. What do all these events have in common? How was the United States government involved? And how did it all lead to where we are today? All these questions can be answered when we dig deeper into the United States War of Deception. The late 1950s to early 1970s proved to be a difficult time for Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The horrors of the Vietnam War were being broadcasted to Americans everywhere, and protests against it were widespread. The approval rating for fighting the Cold War was at an all-time low. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro had just taken power in Cuba, and Mexican students were rioting in the streets for a socialist revolution. Communism was inching closer and closer to home every day, but the American people were tired of fighting continuous war. So President Nixon needed a new monster for the people to be scared of. This monster became what we know today as the War on Drugs. By the mid-1960s, America had been waging a war on communism in Vietnam for 15 years. Thousands of America's young men had died, and the casualties were much worse for the Vietnamese people. All of these atrocities of the Vietnam War were being heavily documented and broadcasted back in the United States for everyone to see. This led to widespread protests from America's young people, and the approval rating of the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson plummeted. Johnson only recovered when he finally began to withdraw troops from the war, but the Cold War's approval never recovered after Vietnam. This was a major problem for the newly elected president, Richard Nixon. Just like the presidents before him, he needed to fight the Cold War in whatever form it took around the world, but this time he would not have the backing of the American people. Coincidentally, the same hippie movement that protested the Vietnam War also popularized the use of psychedelic drugs like marijuana and LSD. By 1969, 48% of Americans were fed up with this drug use. President Nixon saw this as an opportunity. In the year of his election in 1968, young people began a string of socialist uprisings in Mexico, and marijuana began pouring into the United States from our Mexican border. In an effort to kill two birds with one stone, President Nixon gave a speech in 1971, officially declaring a war on drugs.
As I talked to the people from New York State, I realized the need for money to deal with this problem. I am glad that in this administration we have increased the amount of money for handling the problem of dangerous drugs sevenfold. It will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future. I want to say, however, that despite our budget problems, to the extent money can help in meeting the problem of dangerous drugs, it will be available. This is one area where we cannot have budget cuts, because we must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
After declaring a war on drugs, Nixon's approval rating went up by 10% and he won re-election by a landslide in 1972. But more importantly, it gave the president a passport into any country he wanted and a blank check to go with it, all with no questions asked from the American people.
The war on drugs continued to be fought in the next decade, but the U.S.'s main focus was still on defeating communism, specifically in Latin America. To do so, the U.S. enlisted the help of Panama's dictator, Manuel Noriega. In exchange for money, and the U.S. turning a blind eye to drug trafficking coming out of Panama, Noriega offered in return to conduct sabotage raids inside Nicaragua in support of the Reagan administration's efforts to oust the Sandinista government, a socialist-leaning Nicaraguan government. This was furthered when Noriega offered a plan to the U.S. asking if U.S. officials can help clean up his image and lift the ban on arms sales to the Panamanian Defense Force. Noriega will take care of the Sandinista leadership. The Reagan administration was concerned about evidence linking Noriega to drug trafficking, money laundering, and political corruption. If information had gotten out to the American people, might have stood against the war on drugs, which would in turn halt the U.S. in its goal to exterminate communism. This exchange of information between Noriega and the U.S. is controversial because Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking and the U.S.'s knowledge of it. The U.S.'s ability to turn a blind eye to drugs in return for support against communism was shown further during the Vietnam War. While in Vietnam, the U.S. offered funding to heroin-producing areas within Vietnam as long as they pledged to fight against the communist uprising. This turning of a blind eye by the U.S. government illustrates that the U.S.'s main goal was not to fight drugs, but to fight communism. In the 1980s, U.S. focus shifted to Colombia, where Pablo Escobar was making millions every day off the cocaine trade. The total foreign aid to Colombia to be spent on drug interdiction grew from 30 to 70% between 1984 and 1987. Although the drug trade was a problem in Colombia, the U.S. government used the war on drugs as a way to enter Colombia with the real goal of fighting communist rebel groups within Colombia. The communist threat was used to justify counterinsurgency operations against the FARC, ELN, M19, and EPL rebels, whose communist and socialist roots posed a particular threat to U.S. economic interests due to Colombia's extensive natural resources and strategic geographical location. Further connections between the drug trade and communism were realized when the communist militant group M19 seized the Colombian Palace of Justice. It was likely that they did this at the request of Pablo Escobar, who needed criminal evidence destroyed. Although ties were found between communist groups and drug lords like Pablo Escobar, this was not always the case. It is because of this that the U.S. is further criticized for its motivation to declare a war on drugs, due to the fact that both communist and anti-communist groups benefited from the drug trade. While Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel were not a communist group, they indirectly threatened the U.S.'s goals in Colombia to eliminate communism. They accomplished this by fighting Colombia's extradition laws and forming the anti-extradition group Los Extraditables. This group used violence to try to scare the Colombian people and government into banning extradition. When extradition was eventually banned, the U.S. lost significant reason to be in Colombia and could not fight communism from growing there. The United States government is also criticized for trying to fix the U.S. drug problem by eliminating the supply instead of killing the demand. This strategy proved ineffective because as long as there is money to be made and high demand, someone will always find a way to create drugs and ship them to the U.S. It also brings up the question of why the U.S. focused more on eliminating the supply rather than the demand. This further supports the theory that the war on drugs abroad was in part an excuse to fight communism in nearby Latin American countries.
In 1971, President Nixon marketed the war on drugs to the American people as a new, all-out offensive to face the drug problem in the United States. Although over the next several decades it began to show its true face as a justification for the U.S. government to go into communist-leading countries. This new approach to foreign policy led the United States into an era of interaction with foreign nations. The United States government began to explore lands they had never interacted with before, like Nicaragua and Colombia. This led to an exchange of ideas and culture that would especially end up changing South and Central American politics drastically. And as the war on drugs continues to be fought in America today, it is important to remember that things are never as black and white as they seem.